It is very fortunate that the sun is going directly into my eyeball, right here, and there's no realistic way to avoid it. This is a video in the series of specific hazards and how we address them when they become disasters, the sorts of measures that we do. For this video, we're going to first look at the hazard, the way it works, the mechanisms of how it's made and how it operates, look at what that means, so because of how it works, how that affects people or how we can adjust our way of thinking about it. And then we're going to look at the specific sorts of measures that we put in place to address this when it potentially becomes a disaster through the standard 5 pillars of emergency management: prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. The hazard of the day today, or the hazard of the month or the week or of the whenever we decide to release these videos, is hurricanes. So we're looking at hurricanes. Technically not just hurricanes, we're also counting typhoons, ocean-based wind water storms that spin in the southern, northern hemisphere, what have you. All of those, tropical depressions, etc., all those. We're looking at those today. So how do you bake a hurricane? You have the ingredients you want to put into your oven and you want to create a hurricane. How do you make it? There's a few different components, and as per usual with these more informative videos, I got notes. It's important to kind of get the basics of it. Okay, so hurricanes are basically a giant steam engine. If you know what a steam engine is, a lot of this is going to make a lot of sense pretty fast. If you don't know what a steam engine is, that's fine, don't worry, we'll get there. But hurricanes are basically a giant steam engine. You really need about 4 components to make a hurricane. In the order that we're going to be going through them, we need warm ocean water, we need low vertical wind shear, we need high humidity, and we need the Coriolis effect. On the warm ocean water piece, hot air rises, cold air falls. The reason for this is because when air and water vapor gets hotter, it becomes less dense. And the denser air, which is colder, basically falls through it, where the hot air rises above it. This is an incredibly important concept when it comes to hurricanes. With warm ocean water, what will happen is the water, when it gets hot enough, will start evaporating. And this evaporation will create water vapor, which, being hot, will want to rise. This is going to create basically a giant column. So for that, we have a large, old school at-home flashlight here to sort of demonstrate that. So you've got this big column. So what's going to happen is at the ocean surface, you're going to have evaporation of the water, and it's going to rise and rise and rise. While it's doing this, because it's forcing the motion of air upwards, it's creating basically a pseudo vacuum or a low pressure center right below. So all this air here is being forced up, and this is creating a low pressure zone. Whenever you have a low pressure zone, material, water, air, whatever, is going to want to go from high pressure to low pressure. So at the base here, you have low pressure. It's going to attract in effectively high pressure from all sides. So what happens is the air from the surrounding part of this low pressure zone is going to start rushing towards it from all angles. So imagine you have a bunch of ice in the middle of a bucket of water, and you were to pick the ice up really quickly. What happens, right? The water rushes in to fill that void that you've made from taking the ice out of the water or taking the object out of the water. It's the same sort of idea here, but it's happening with air. So this rises, stuff goes in to fill the void. At the top of this, eventually the air hits basically the cloud line, condensation occurs. So right here you had liquid water becoming water vapor, and up here you have air water, water vapor becoming liquid again, and clouds form. Because this now becomes a high pressure zone, the air gets forced outwards in all directions, and then clouds form and it drops through rain. What this effectively means is you have this center column of it going up, and then you have this ring, kind of like a donut ring, around the center column of the water going down. And it creates this cycle in a ring around this whole little zone of evaporation that's happening around the water. Okay, that's the first concept. Low pressure, air in, column, cycle, repeat, repeat, repeat. That's the first thing you need, warm ocean water. The second thing you need is low vertical wind shear. Now, to explain wind shear, basically you need this column to be as straight as possible. If the column starts tilting, what will happen is that perfect sort of engine that's going on right now doesn't become as efficient, and you can't easily form the later parts of what you need here. So when the wind is going towards this in all directions, if it is sort of imbalanced in the wrong way, or if it contacts this column and pushes the column into a tilt, then it won't be as vertical as possible. The more vertical your column is and the tighter it is, the more aggressive the storm becomes. So you need low vertical wind shear. So this column, which is vertical, has to not get sheared to the side and get kind of elongated in a weird way. That's the second thing that you need for a hurricane. The third thing that you need for a hurricane, high humidity, is very, very important. Because this whole engine is dependent on water vapor and water being heated and cooled and etc. in a cycle, if you have an area that doesn't have enough humidity, there's not enough basically fuel to hit this engine. When you have very, very dry winds during certain seasons, this gets into like El Nino and La Nina seasons in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans respectively, then there isn't enough humidity in the air to fuel this very, very hungry engine. The water in the ocean isn't actually enough to fuel this thing. You also need effectively water in the air because of just how much energy this thing uses and how much it needs to cycle through. Humidity becomes a very, very important factor in this whole thing. Just keep in mind, you got to have that low pressure center, this vertical column. You've got to have low wind shear, and you've got to have enough water in this thing for it to do what it wants to do. Okay, fourth thing you need, and if you don't have this, you will not get a hurricane, is you need something called the Coriolis Effect. Without the Coriolis Effect, you have a hot column. In order to get this thing to spin, and in order for the hurricane to spin, you need the Coriolis Effect. With just the low pressure center, all the air goes straight. You need the air to miss. Now, there's a few different ways to explain the Coriolis Effect. I'll try this way. There's a concept called inertia. Inertia is something in physics where if you were to move, so let's say you were to run sideways and were to push a ball straight forward, the ball would not go straight. The ball would go straight plus a distance to the side based on the speed that you're going. So your inertia, the speed that you're already moving at, the ball is accelerating with you, and when you push it, that has to be accounted for in physics. So while you may view the ball as going straight, because you're moving and the ball is moving with you, the ball actually goes diagonal. Another way to think about this would be jumping out of a car in an emergency. So let's say your car is about to crash, and for whatever reason, you're able to jump out of your car, or people who, hop off of bicycles or motorcycles or whatever in the event of an extreme crash. You don't just stop. You're still moving. You need to roll out of this, or you need to deal with the fact that you're still moving when you leave the vehicle. Now, you're not moving with the vehicle, but you still have that inertia. This is incredibly important and fundamental to the Coriolis Effect because the Coriolis Effect is based on inertia. You are on a giant spinning top because the Earth spins. Now, technically, the ground is moving beneath you on the spinning Earth, and then the Earth is moving in the solar system and is spinning, and the solar system is spinning, so we're spinning while we're spinning while we're spinning. For all intents and purposes, you only really need to care about the Earth spinning part for this. The Coriolis Effect starts mattering with very large weather systems and starts mattering when you have to calculate things over extreme distances. Snipers, for example, like military snipers, people who shoot very long distances, like extremely long distances, we're talking kilometers for sport, have to account for the Coriolis Effect because of what will happen to the bullet. To help explain, this is a globe. If you have a globe, the Earth spins eastward. The equator is moving faster than the pole. If you're standing at the exact north or south pole respectively, you're not moving. You're spinning, but you're not actually moving a distance when we're talking about the Earth spinning. You're moving in space, but you're not moving here. When you're at the equator, in one day, you're moving a huge distance. If you were to take a string, for example, and were to tape it to a globe and then to spin it around and see how long the string is and do that at different elevations here, you could measure how you're moving a different distance. The difference in how far you're going means that you're actually moving at different speeds depending on where you're standing on the planet. This will affect the hurricane significantly. I believe the number is around 1,600 kilometers an hour, but I need to check it, and John, you can put it up in post. But if you're standing at the equator, you're moving over 1,000 kilometers an hour faster than if you're standing at the North Pole. Because of this, you're effectively on a top or a gravitron. The farther you are from the middle, the more quickly you're spinning. If you're in the center of a spinning top, you're not moving a distance. The further you are from the edge, the more you're moving. It can be thought of also by angling it like so and spinning it like so. You're farther away from the top. When you have something spinning on a top, it will force things to miss when they're thrown directly at the center. So if you were to be spinning around and you were to throw a ball at the center of whatever you're spinning around on, like a merry-go-round really. If you were to throw a ball directly at the center, and as long as you weren't throwing it like way faster than you were spinning, the ball is going to miss and bank to the right if you're spinning counterclockwise, and to the left if you're spinning clockwise. You can think about it this way. Or we're spinning around the center of this. I am moving like this. If I throw towards that in the center, this is going to miss this way. It's going to miss this way. It's not going to hit it because I'm moving in this direction. So the ball wants to move with me when it leaves my hands. Because of this, the degree to which the Earth is trying to sort of pull you in a different direction is different at different levels here. You're going faster at the equator than you're going at the poles respectively, and when you have something that's moving northward or southward respectively, it's pulling you in a different direction. Now, the center of the hurricane is basically this section of water and this low pressure zone that's at the surface. So it's moving at one speed in one direction. Technically, it wants to be pulled eastward because the Earth is moving underneath it really quickly. Because of how the forces of this deflect with the different speed of this being slower and this being faster, the hurricane in the north hemisphere is going to get pushed west and north. In the southern hemisphere, it gets pushed south and west. So they're both being pushed west because the Earth is rotating east. It's kind of running away from them, and they're being pushed away from the fast thing. It's like when your car speeds off without you and you get left behind. The car is the planet and you are the hurricane, effectively. It's running away from you. If you look at this ball here, so imagine this ball is the hurricane and this paper is the planet. If I just pull this paper, the ball leaves it. Like it wants to go with it, but it can't keep up, right? This ball is effectively like a fluid because hurricanes are dynamically, they're fluids. It's like having Jello on a plate because the Jello is like a fluid, like wobbles. So you like have to, it moves with it. This thing is just going east and it's going a different speed, equator versus north and south. So the faster part is going away from you. So it forces you west and north relative because it's running away from you. Okay. The center of the hurricane is going away from the equator, so north or south respectively, depending on which hemisphere you're in, and it's going west. The wind is being fired at this hurricane from all directions. So this column, let's say that you're, in the northern hemisphere, this column is going here. So this column is going north and west. While it's going north and west, at the column, wind is being fired at it. But because it's going north and west, and this is going here, this is moving, relatively speaking, alongside it with inertia. I want to go this way, but this is moving this way. So I'm forced to miss it. This wind over here is attempting the same thing. This wind is faster, basically, because it's closer to the equator part, and this is moving away this way. This is slower here, but the same phenomenon happens because you're on a top and it misses this way. So because this thing is moving underneath you and this is going in every direction, it just so happens that all the directions of this wind that's going towards this low pressure zone in the column all miss to the right. So this misses to the right, this misses to the right, this misses to the right, this misses to the right. And when you have a bunch of winds that all miss to the right, you have a vortex. Because they're all going to the center, but they're all missing to the right, and they're forced into a cyclical vortex. And you have a hurricane, or the start of one. Okay, so that's how you bake a hurricane. Low pressure column, evaporation, condensation cycle, strong enough wind to create cyclone, but not so strong that we tilt the wind shear. Enough moisture that you have the water to fuel the system, and it gotta spin. It gotta be on a top, or it's just a column, okay? What does this mean for how we respond to this hazard? Hurricanes primarily have two components that really harm people. Significant amounts of wind and significant amounts of water. The water is often called storm surge, and the wind is a giant windstorm. In addition to that, hurricanes can form smaller tornado weather systems, come with thunderstorms, and have other issues that they create. But the two big things that are talked about specifically usually are lots of wind and lots of water. Your hurricane is going in the northern hemisphere, north and west. It's spinning counterclockwise all the time. If you are going northwest, the direction we're moving has a speed. The velocity of the rotation has a speed. The right side of a hurricane, the speed at the exact right point, is the speed of the trajectory it's moving along the ground effectively, plus the speed of the vortex. The speed of the hurricane's winds on the opposite side is the speed of the vortex minus the trajectory of where you're going. For that reason, on the northern hemisphere, if you're on the right side of the hurricane, you are an exact measurable number more in danger than the left. All other things being equal, so the sides of the distance from the eye wall, etc., being the same, the right is always more dangerous than the left with hurricanes because they're moving while they're moving. Now, in the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite because it's spinning in the other direction. In their case, because you're facing it the other way, it's the left side. But if you were to sort of view a globe from north to south, and you were to look at it that way, and you weren't to flip your perspective, it would still be the right side, but it's just going down instead of up. But the point is the direction that it's spinning in plus the distance it's going is more dangerous. This is why when a hurricane moves, if your house was in this zone and then the hurricane decided to shift and do this, it just went from being on the left side of the eye to the right. So before the warning may have been, you can probably shelter in place, and now the warning is you evacuating. You were the same distance from the center of the hurricane, but the side was the entire difference there. That's the wind thing that you need to know about this that's unique to hurricanes. Tornadoes are completely different because the cyclones, the vortexes are very small, so they don't have that same sort of phenomenon the same way. The way like hurricanes are huge. Okay, storm surge. Hurricanes carry all this water with them. When you have a shoreline, okay, we have like a flat shoreline. This is a very steep shoreline, but this will exemplify the point. This is the ocean floor. This is your house. The hurricane is doing this. It's pulling all this water with it, and it's kind of like a broom moving sand, but the sand is water. And it also moves some sand too. It's like dug its hand into this and it's scooping it up. When it gets here, the water has nowhere to go. So it has to come up. This is called storm surge. So it pushes it up because it has nowhere to go, and it just basically carries the water with it. This creates essentially an incredibly high tide, effectively. When you have a completely flat sort of seafloor that doesn't have hills or walls or something in place to stop this, it just scoops it, has no impediment, and there goes your house. This is why when we get to strategies for dealing with this on especially the mitigation side, a lot of those strategies surround putting physical barriers in the way of the ability of the hurricane to scoop this water like a broom sweeping on a hill. You know how I talked about the low pressure zone? Now, that also is going to lift the water a bit. It's going to try to suck it up like a vacuum, but that effect is very little. It's negligible compared to the broom. So while it does happen, it's not that big of a deal. I just wanted to mention that. I made notes on specific things to do with the water and the storm surge. Step one, The hurricane gets near the coast, so it approaches the coast, okay? Step 2, the wind pushes the water and like scoops it because it's going this way and it's just pushing the water up and up and up and up. The low pressure from that bubble lifts it a bit, which helps with the scooping, but largely the scooping is already happening. That's step 3. Step 4, the water starts building up near the shore. This effect with that slope changes the risk profile of it, but that slope is the big thing. Based on your tide level, this also affects it too. So the effects of the moon and gravity and other things around the world cause the seawater to rise and fall. The high tide comes in and the sea basically rises, and then low tide comes in and the sea basically falls based on time of day. If you have a hurricane at high tide, because the water's already high, more water rushes in because there's more water to rush in. That's basically the idea there. Now, add all this together, and if you have a small coastal bay with a high elevation during high tide, you basically make Atlantis. You become under the sea. That's in principle all of the stuff around the hazard I wanted to explain for hurricane. Now I just want to go into what you do about it based off of the 5 emergency management pillars. Okay, now what do you do about it? What do you do about this hurricane that's hitting the coast? Breaking down point by point, prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. On the prevention side, all you really can do is land use planning. So largely you risk being hit by a hurricane if you're closer to a coast, and especially if you are below sea level or closer to a low sea level elevation. The way that you stop yourself from being hit by a hurricane is not being there. One thing related to this, when Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005, the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans in particular got hit very, very hard. There are a lot of reasons for this. There's a longer explanation. If you want to know more about this, I would also encourage you to look into the Hurricane PAM exercise. The Hurricane PAM exercise was an exercise that was done 1 year before Hurricane Katrina in 2004, and it fairly clearly outlined all the things that would happen if a hurricane hit. And then a year later it did, and they just didn't learn anything or really do anything from the exercise. It was one of the most expensive I told you so's in American history. Really cool thing to look into if you're curious. One thing though, so with the lower Ninth Ward, it got flooded out. We're talking certain parts of New Orleans, including lower Ninth Ward. Your house was basically buried up to the ceiling in water. People were completely flooded out. Some people who needed evacuation who were unable to evacuate for a variety of reasons, which if we make a video on Hurricane Katrina, I'll get into it, but not right now, or had to like stand on their ceiling and hope for rescue because their house was underwater. Post Hurricane Katrina, one of the recommendations was to basically turn large parts of the lower Ninth Ward into a golf course. Now, some people go, these are people's homes, you can't do this, why would you do this? But from a prevention standpoint, and even from a mitigation standpoint, some of these other things, New Orleans is in a bowl. It's a large part of it is below sea level, and if it wasn't for sort of artificial human infrastructure being made to make it so it could survive, New Orleans would be underwater large parts of the year. It's not supposed to, basically naturally supposed to be a place where people live. It doesn't have enough wetland areas to absorb the water that regularly is at risk of flooding it. So they have like water pumps and levees and all this expensive stuff in there to try to deal with this. But what they need from a risk management perspective is green stuff that soaks up water, fundamentally. Now, one of the easiest ways to create a green stuff that soaks up water place that becomes economically viable is by making a golf course. Because a golf course for many people is basically a sporting activity that's done on top of a marsh, effectively. Like really, you have your water traps, you just whack a ball around on top of a marsh. So if it floods out, whatever. So this is complicated. Anyways, the point is land use planning and saying, you know what, we're not going to develop here. We're going to make sure that this is here to trap water, and if we need it, your conservation authority, watershed management stuff, all that, that's pretty much what you're focusing on when it comes to prevention. Mitigation has a lot of that as well. So if you can't fully prevent it and it's partially mitigating it, it's still land use planning. You also have something called preventing coastal erosion. Now, even though the word prevent is in that, it's a mitigation measure. Coastal erosion is when your sand on your beach gets eroded away over time. And this basically gets the sea closer to you. So you have less of a barrier between you and the storm surge when it happens. So what you want to do is basically keep your beach sandy and keep the water from encroaching, so that when it does happen, you have more of a buffer. In addition to that, you've got coastal defenses. A lot of this is stuff that gets in the way of scoopage. A reef is an underwater physical thing that gets in the way of the water moving. So if your reef is gone, it's easier to scoop. If you have like large sandbars, so you have like, your indentation, your sandbar, your indentation, this is something that's in the way of scoopage. You have a seawall, so you have a giant physical structure that's a certain height. It's something that's physically in the way of scoopage. Levees, same thing, physical walls. Most of this stuff on the mitigation side for hurricanes is usually, frankly, dealing with the water portion, because Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines was a bigger wind problem, but most of these hurricanes and typhoons, it's the storm surge that gets you. A lot of this is either build on higher elevation or put a physical barrier in the way. The great thing about a lot of disasters is the solutions are very straightforward. They're expensive often and very big in scale, but they're very straightforward. I don't want water. I put brick. Right? I want to make a joke about building a wall and making sure that everyone pays for it, but I think that, anyways. So your infrastructure resilience is relevant. If you're an area that's expected to be hit by hurricanes often, and your power lines are up and they're low enough that they can be impacted by the water, and realistically vulnerable to the windstorms, you're better off burying them. And there are many areas that bury power lines. In Canada, we bury a lot of our lines because of cold temperature, and sometimes our unburied lines get hit by windstorms pretty badly and ice storms. So a lot of your infrastructure, you put it underground. I make another note about golf courses here because they work for this. You might as well, if what you need to do to get the wetland approved is make it into a golf course, then it's better than getting flooded out. I like the idea of having national parks and and having enough sort of natural infrastructure to help you manage this. But if the only thing that's going to make it work is a golf course, then just build the darn golf course, because things have to get politically approved. Fair enough. If you're in an environment that is expected to get flooded out all the time, what they'll commonly do is in the building codes, they'll have no basement. So basements are basically illegal. And very often their first floor will just be solid concrete, or they'll build a house on stilts. Basically, they have a bunch of like wooden or concrete pillars, and they don't have a first floor because it's going to flood. You just walk up, and the whole city, basically, their whole neighborhood, the first floor is just nothing because they assume it gets flooded out. So they have the wiggle room of one floor of elevation before they have a problem. So there are areas where they don't have pipes underground the same way because the infrastructure can't really handle it, and they just concrete it up one level. This is a thing. So you can do this sorts of stuff if you know you're going to get flooded out. When you're building a shelter, is your shelter at a higher elevation? If you build your evacuation shelter at a lower elevation than the places you're evacuating, the shelter gets flooded out before the house. That is stupid. Why would you do that? Right? That doesn't make, if you're making a shelter for storm surge, it should be a more hardened target against the hurricane than the thing you're evacuating from. Okay, on the preparedness side. Preparedness side comes down to early warning systems, training, and not getting surprised effectively. For hurricanes, days in advance. These things take time to build. They have to be the tropical depression that builds energy, becomes tropical storm, gets upgraded into hurricane categories. We have the whole hurricane category system based on wind speed, etc. In advance with hurricanes, but you need to have that system in place. Certain countries that have their own satellites and have more advanced telecommunication systems, ways to notify people, are much better at responding to hurricanes than others. When something bad happens, you could get a notification on your phone, it gets blasted all over social media, the news is talking about it, you get notification real fast. If you're from a country that doesn't have its own satellite, there's no, coordinated, effective central government that really notifies people, you could not know the hurricane's there until it's there. People often take for granted early warning systems, but we have the technology for it, and they do exist. And they're really important for this. If you know that you need to evacuate 5 days before the hurricane hits you, then you can be gone. If 3 hours, you are not evacuating a major city in 3 hours. It's not happening. You can evacuate a major city in a week. You could, right? But you're not doing it in 3 hours. The early warning is really important. Okay. Emergency plans in general are important. You need to have a bunch of training and drills on how to get to a shelter, how to evacuate, how to do shelter in place. You need to design the shelters with this in mind. Like, you know, not all buildings are the same. If anyone remembers the old Three Little Pigs tale, you know, if you have a building that's made out of bricks, it's going to be better than the one made out of sticks. And not all building codes are the same. Further, when it comes to storm surge, if you have a building that has one floor and it's at sea level as opposed to a raised building, it makes a huge difference. Right. Public education, a really big part of this. So a lot of people don't know how hurricanes work. They don't understand the methodology of why this stuff happens. When it comes to disasters, it's important to help people understand why certain decisions are made, why certain decisions that are made quickly might be wrong. One of the big criticisms that came up with COVID was the poor communication in certain areas with healthcare professionals to the public. If people understood why decisions were changing, then there wouldn't have been as much pushback. So the public education piece is really important. Sort of empowering the public with the knowledge involving this stuff helps them understand, or better, you know, take in the guidance that's happening and helps them make more informed, better decisions. You know, you can't learn everything about everything, but if you're in an area where you're going to see a hurricane once a year or once every 3 years, it's a regular occurrence, you expect to see it, you should probably know a bit more about them. That way you're more protected and you can make better decisions. I'm going to get into response now. And one thing I want to mention involving this that feeds into the education piece from before. And actually, if you think about it, this YouTube video is a public education piece. So this is a preparedness measure in of itself, as an example. One thing that happens very often is during hurricanes and other voluntary evacuations generally, a disaster worker, which in most areas will often be police, local police will handle a lot of this, but the whole emergency services band together generally for this, but police have the largest force for it. They'll go door to door to houses and say, hey, it's time to evacuate, you need to evacuate, to just, you know, check that no one got left behind, no one missed the message. Maybe someone doesn't have a cell phone and they did turn their radio off and they just didn't know that a hurricane was coming. So you go door to door just in case. There are a significant enough number of people when you get there will say, I don't want to leave, this is my house, I'll be fine. So some version of I'm not leaving or I'm not evacuating. And they have whatever reason they want for that. It is now, since basically Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and then it's evolved over time, it's now, depending on the jurisdiction, effectively common practice for a lot of these disaster workers to say, okay, that's fine, that's your choice. If you don't mind, could you please take a black marker? Here, I have one for you if need be. And could you put your social security number on your arm so that when we come back to identify your body, we can notify your family? And then they move on because they don't have time to try to convince that person that they need to leave. That may sound callous and people may take that different ways, but the situation is such that that is now kind of standard procedure and you may read into that what you will. We'll leave it there. Okay, now as far as response is concerned, this is the stuff that you're doing when the hurricane actually hits. There's a variety of things that you can do here. The evacuation itself and how you evacuate, I would argue, is a response measure. That's kind of a hybrid preparedness response measure, but you still try to do some evacuations and some rescue during the actual event. Although while the hurricane is directly over top of you, it's not safe to do anything more than shelter in place generally, but there is some element of evacuation still. There's a bunch of communication and coordination work. Very often during these weather events, all of the communication infrastructure is wiped out. Cell towers, good luck, they're not working. You have to kind of rebuild the communication infrastructure from the ground up, find what's still working, find out what you can retrofit, etc. There's a huge part of that to just, you know, find out where people are, find out what resources you have, find out who was able to show up for work. And by that, I mean like the emergency responders. You need to get information and you got to set that all up again. You have your standard 911 responders, which are doing more than their normal job description usually in this sort of event. I think that's pretty self-evident to most people. That's the response for hurricanes in there. You have specialized search and rescue units, people who often will come in with boats on a city where that's normally where a car goes, but the water's so high, that's a boat now. So you have people driving around on boats trying to help evacuate people from flooded out areas. You'll have specialized units that are very, very good at search and rescue to try to get people out of buildings that may be compromised. You're going to have emergency shelters, which have to have food supply, clean water supply, medical facilities, on-staff nurses often, access to medications if you have diabetics that require insulin and they don't have it on them and they're going into diabetic shock in your shelter, it's a problem. So there's a whole pharmacy element of this. If you have 2 working showers in a shelter of 600 people, you run into some logistical bathroom issues. There's a whole shelter piece to this. Social services, you have a hurricane and 1,000 people are dead. You find kids whose parents are now deceased and they're alone. That has to be addressed. In more recent history, we started thinking about pets. Pets are actually a new thing. 30 plus years ago, they basically weren't considered in a lot of disasters. And now they're actually being given special attention depending on the jurisdiction. So pets are an element now too in the response of these things, which is interesting. And then as far as the hazard is concerned directly, you got to get the water out. So like pumps, like large pumps, buckets, helping it drain normally, whatever. There's a whole bunch of different things depending on your area for the response side of getting the water out. Buckets are brutal. You're usually not using buckets to get rid of the water in a hurricane. That's usually an exercise in futility, but for more localized things you could. You can sandbag to a degree as a response measure, but usually you want to do that in the preparedness side, like preparedness mitigation, when you know it's coming, to create that artificial extra barrier. By the time the water is there, it's usually too late to sandbag, but there's that too. Okay. Recovery, the recovery section. You've got insurance, you've got build back better, you've got build back the same, and you've got don't rebuild. That's basically what you got in recovery. Stuff will have been destroyed, assuming this is a hurricane that created a disaster, because if a hurricane hits nobody, then it's not a disaster, right? You have stuff that's been destroyed, you have damage assessment, and then at a society level, sometimes at a local level, depending on how this works out, you need to decide for every given area, are you going to improve on the infrastructure and kind of use the free demolition the hurricane did for you as an opportunity to improve the infrastructure? Are you going to try to rebuild and reset to what you had before? Or are you going to say, you know what, it's not worth rebuilding there, we're going to go a different direction? Those are basically your three choices. There's a bunch of sub-choices or different versions within that, but it's essentially your three choices. Now, all three of these choices are valid in different contexts. Most people will prefer the Build Back Better option, but Build Back Better option, however, for many people is very expensive and you can run into jurisdictional issues. So, for example, in the Hurricane Katrina example again, the levees that were breached were a state resource, and the organization that was repairing them was a federal resource, the Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps of Engineers, at the time, this was a hugely controversial thing at the time, was not allowed to do Build Back Better, because if it did, it would have been unfairly advantaging Louisiana. And it's not fair to the other states if Louisiana gets a federal resource that treats it special on improving its infrastructure. They can help them in a disaster context with evacuation, but it's Louisiana's responsibility to make sure Louisiana's infrastructure is protected. So for that reason, the Army Corps of Engineers basically said, we'll build you back to where you were before. It's your responsibility to improve. So sometimes, because of jurisdictional issues and the way laws are written, etc., it is the correct decision in a different context to not build back better, even though you'd want to. This can get actually complicated and political sometimes. And then, we mentioned the lower Ninth Ward and the golf course thing. There are many people that argue that these low-lying areas that get flooded out regularly, that are very difficult to improve as far as infrastructure is concerned, a lot of them should just be turned into wetlands and people should live somewhere else. This is a repeated theme. You have this sort of thing come up in Canada with First Nations reserves all the time, where we evacuate them every year from wildfires and floods. And people will commonly say, look, this is a community of 1,000 people, just move them. And then for any number of reasons, it's decided that you're not going to move them. People don't want to leave their homes, right? It's you just forcibly relocating people is not the sort of measure that's taken lightly. But that is in your recovery strategy long term, the sorts of things you look at. And there's a whole thing on insurance, but that still applies. That is everything basically on hurricanes. Now, other videos I've seen on hurricanes do that in about 2 minutes, and they don't tell you anything. And this was longer than 2 minutes, which I appreciate. So we're going to see how much we can cut this up and put in visuals and make it simple. And then ideally, we'll see if we can make a bunch of shorts on this to make it easier to digest, because I know there's a lot in there. Hopefully, after watching this, you've gained a better understanding of the way hurricanes work, the reason why that has certain sorts of dangers that we focus on, and then what you do about those dangers and how you're impacted by them. This was by all means not an exhaustive thing on this. You could do half of a university program on just hurricanes as a hazard and disaster category alone, but this is sort of, I wanted to make the high level but fairly broad summary for everybody so that you had it. So have a good day, everybody, and unfortunately, this is a globe.